Hi, and welcome to this presentation on culture dimensions based on Trompenaars' work. I'll be leading you through the 7 dimensions and highlighting the relevance in the context of business communication in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Trompenaars and Hamden Turner are researchers that have done extensive research in the context of management and international business. Trompenaars wrote the book Riding the Waves of Culture and also Business Across Cultures together with Peter Williams, and both are really interesting books and worth taking a look at. The research background of Trompenaars, on which these 7 dimensions are based, that they set up a set of dilemma scenarios, and respondents were invited to make choices based on these scenarios. The respondents were from more than 47 different countries. There were about 30,000 informants questioned, and this makes it a very comprehensive study, which is slowly coming into age, but it's relevant because of its context in the business world, because of how well and how diverse the data set is, and it's been praised because of its integration in this globalized business world. Trompenaars is a very influential thinker in the world of intercultural competence and business competence, and he became very well known for his phrase, "There is no cultural independence of management." So let's just dive straight in and have a look at the 7 value dimensions that they developed. A lot of the work of Trompenaars and Hamden Turner was based on the previous work of these Israeli Schwartz and of others. So they came up with a set of 7 dimensions, which I will lead you through now in this sequence. The first one is, what do we base our decisions on? Do we orient ourselves by rules or by relationships? This dimension is called Universalism versus Particularism. In universal cultures, one expects that rules and guidelines regulate the means of business, means of communication. They settle how things are done. Now, in a FHNY context, which is very universal, there are guidelines, rules, and regulations clarifying just about everything. So the idea is that you develop a consensus based on values or systems or priorities, whatever, and then this will become a basis of orientation for further decisions and questions that individuals have. In particular business context or cultures, the expectation is that the relationship defines the options taken. I'll give you an example. A student approached me a couple of semesters ago who was doing an exchange semester from India, and she said, "Professor Mark, would it be okay if I submit the paper a bit later? I'm just not quite ready yet." And I said, "I'm sorry, there's the same applies for all the students. The deadline is then and then." And then she looked at me and said, "Yeah, but I've been participating in class and I thought that we got to get on well." And I said, "Yes, we do. But I cannot just make exceptions because of the relationship, the student-teacher relationship we've established here." And she was puzzled. And I said, "Look, this is a universal system. The same rules apply for everybody, and that's how we define fairness. So common agreements have a higher priority than individual relationships. This defines our interpretation of loyalty. It determines what we put in contract, in legal written contract, and where oral agreement is sufficient. It determines how trust comes into play, in particular societies where the relationship is predominant. Of course, individual, mutual, relational trust is very important, versus in universal cultures or systems, where the trust in an institution, the trust is here that the system will regulate things in a fair way, etc. I think you're getting the idea. I'd like to share you the example that Trompenaars and Hamden developed as one of these dilemmas which they presented to the people participating in the study. So imagine you're riding a car driven by a close friend and he hits a pedestrian. You were aware that he was driving at least 35 miles per hour in a zone where you're only allowed to drive 20. But there were no other witnesses, luckily, and his lawyer says that if you testify under oath that he was only driving 20, it may save him from further consequences. Now the question is, what right does your friend have to expect from you that you will protect him? Take a short moment to think about this. Now in the options we have is the friend has a definitive right to expect that I testify to the lower speed. He has some right as a friend, or he has no right. The interesting response from this study done by Hamden Turner and Trompenaars was that 97% of informants from Switzerland said that he has no right to expect that I would lie under oath. In other words, just because he's my friend doesn't have any influence on my behavior. Versus, let's go down to the bottom of the chart, you see Russia, Korea, Venezuela, where the majority of the informants said, of course he has a right to expect that I would change the story, that it serves the relationship and reflects the relationship. Now, you see the relevance of this in business, in how we collaborate, what we perceive as fair, what we perceive as a right that one can expect, for example, from a team member or from a superior, from my team manager, that is subjective to the cultural programming or norms that I have been socialized in. And this is a good expression of universal versus particular cultural relevance and how it shapes very concretely my expectation of friendship, but it also has an impact on my behavior versus legal systems, etc. This alone is a really fascinating aspect. You will become aware that we in the FHNY are in a very universal system, and that can be a challenge if you're coming from a particular cultural system or context. I would say as such that in universal cultures and especially in universal business context, there is often a strong expectation that those coming from a particular context would adapt. I guess this applies vice versa as well, but I just want to point out that necessity to be sensitive, and maybe you remember the DMIS model here and how that could apply in these contexts. Am I aware and sensitive to other interpretation options in contexts that are universal and particular? The second dimension is, do we function in a group or as individuals? In individual cultures and systems, that can be a small culture, a large culture, there is a strong orientation of self. So whatever serves me is quite of importance and significant. There is often a quick decision-making process because reaching a decision is more important than strong ownership in the decision-making. If we look at compensation systems, we will see that they're based on individual remuneration preferences and systems, etc. In a collective, as Hofstede says, or Trompenaars talks of communitarism culture, the family, the culture, the immediate group in which I am part of, think of cultural identity here, is really significant to my identity of self. So I will refer to myself in the context of the group that I belong to. So a lot of the reflections of what will I do in the future? Shall I choose this or that professional orientation? Shall I accept this job offer or not? They are made not in the light of just my individual life plan, but of what serves us as a whole. In collective cultures, many in the Middle East, in Latin America, but also in Africa, we see the expressions of this in the society as a whole. In business communication, it's relevant to think of this, especially in light of how does communitarism affect HR processes, feedback systems. We're going to look at that a bit later on in the module. And how does it shape a good decision-making process? Third area is some cultures are, so to which degree do we display our emotions? In some cultures, it's viewed as professional to be neutral. So we do not reveal our emotion that quickly to people who we may not be that close with. It's viewed and expected as professional to hold back, to show restraint. I was working in Cambodia a few months ago, and I got insecure during this workshop with some psychiatric doctors and medical personnel, because there was very little feedback given during this workshop. And I'm not used to not receiving cues whether people are following or not. And at the end of the day, I was a bit insecure, and I said, well, I'm not really sure that this is serving you well. Can I ask you just for a short feedback? And they looked at me quite perplexed and said, of course, Mr. Mark, this is excellent. But, we don't show that we think it's good. That would be unprofessional. As an expression of a neutral society where they've been taught to hold back their emotions. Versus, I remember working in Brazil where, enthusiasm is showed and you get angry and upset and calm down again. And it's all not that dramatic. And being an emotional doesn't necessarily mean that I'm more motivated or not. It's just what's expected of me. So this can have a strong impact on how I evaluate or interpret feedback given, how I gauge engagement. Is somebody committed or not? It can impact negotiation and much more. The fourth dimension is to which degree do we keep business and private life separate? Or in which degree is it okay to have diffuse cultural settings? So private and public just flows into each other. I would say that a lot of the Western cultures are very specific. What is work and private is kept distinct. I even know people who at work, they use the C form, so the formal greeting, and when they go for lunch, they will switch to a du. That's a bit old-fashioned, obviously, but it shows this specific structure to organize life. In specific cultures, one expects that in a negotiation, the important part takes place in a business context. In many Chinese business contexts, this is diffuse. Or even in Russia, I remember doing business in St. Petersburg, and I could never really tell based on the setting, is this now a work setting or a social or both, or is it private? So business happened anywhere at any time where it served the purpose. That could be at 1 a.m. over a shot of vodka. It could be at breakfast. It could be in a business meeting. Diffuse and specific cultures. This is a dimension that is not often really paid attention to in a sufficient manner, I find, because it's really relevant. The fifth area is ascription cultures versus achievement cultures. In ascription cultures, we respect superiority and hierarchy. Titles are important. I want to just point out the dimension of Hofstede here, low and high power distance. There are some similarities in this. In an achievement culture, one can also talk of competence-based cultures. People receive a position based on their competence, their education and their background. And so decisions can be challenged by anybody in a meeting who is competent to do so. In ascription cultures, to some extent, I experienced this in Dubai, sometimes working, people are not encouraged to speak out if they're competent. You only speak out if you correspond to your peer in terms of seniority, gender, social status, and based on that, you're allowed to speak out or not. Or who gets the job. I remember in Chad, where I was leading a team, people were given jobs because they were part of the family system. And of course, as an uncle, it was my duty to make sure that my relatives were considered for a position before those that I don't know. And in an SDC-funded project, this obviously created some tension because the donor was very much achievement based in his cultural understandings. The sixth dimension is, do we control the environment or does it control us? So internalistic versus externalistic cultures. To some degree, this is similar to what Hofstede refers to as feminine and masculine cultures. In internalistic cultures, they tend to be more competitive. There is a focus on what we can achieve. Versus in an externalistic, some confusion-oriented or influence cultures are more externalistic. One is more comfortable with accepting fate, accepting that we live in a context in which not everything is steered and influenced by our means. And so things just happen. And one does not need to try and influence the future to such a degree as internalistic cultures would like to do that. So which relevance does planning have, for example? Which relevance does reviewing have? Those are internalistic orient or influenced tools. Part of time orientation is in here. I want to point out or just remind you of Edward Hall's teaching and research on this. Some cultures are more future-oriented, some more past, some more present, or a mix of it. This goes into this dimension of internalistic and externalistic. And then as a last point, to which degree do we do things one at a time, sequential, or synchronic? Do we manage time? Is time a resource that we are in control of? If so, then of course we attribute time and behavior in very specific ways. If I believe that time isn't a resource under my control, then of course it's totally okay that I just come and show up for the meeting when I show up. In a lot of today's business worlds, it's expected to be sequential. But this may happen in a synchronic cultural context. So you may have a business culture, UBS in Singapore or in Vietnam, very sequential, but the context is more synchronic. So people switch their behavior and their use of time based on the sub or small culture that they're moving in. So I want to stop at this point and just give you a moment to reflect on these aspects. Now, I know I covered a lot in short time, and I encourage you to review this and to think, okay, where do I see myself on these 7 dimensions? Draw in on the scale where you see yourself. Are you more internalistic or more particular? How do you deal with emotions, with time, control of environment? So create a map of how you self-rate yourself based on these 7 dimensions. And I look forward to taking a look at this and hearing from your thoughts in our next session together. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please post them on Moodle or on Teams, and I'm happy to get back to you on that.